Hey friends, welcome back to Thrive Online Healing Podcast. Guess what? It's episode 52. 1 year. We've been doing this for 1 year and it's been so much fun. I love doing it. It's like one of the highlights of my week being a business owner, I guess, is I just love doing this. And I'm so excited to finish our year and talk about this subject. It's like the culmination. This is going to be a possibly 3-part series. It'll be really helpful to listen to this one first as before you go into the other three. Because what we're going to talk about is processing emotion and unprocessed emotion and how it impacts our brain and our body physiologically. There is a correlation, and we're going to dive into how these emotions unprocessed impact us, our biology, our chemistry, our physiology. So I'm going to let Dr. Carmen run with it.
Um, Perfect. I think this is the perfect time because we've talked about some of this stuff sort of in passing, and so by diving in a little bit deeper and understanding how when we talk about our thoughts and our feelings and our emotions, right, and our actions, what does that look like in a neurochemistry, neurobiology sense? And so we're going to get a little bit nerdy and go into some of these things in a little bit more detail. And I thought about when we're talking about unprocessed emotions, it would be helpful to know who the big players are, right? Those neurotransmitters that are in the brain, what their roles are, how can we influence them and change them? And then when we talk about, so those are sort of the neurochemicals, those neurotransmitters. And then when we move into the next episodes, about how they affect our body physiologically, hopefully that will make a little bit more sense, and we're not just throwing words out there. So that's our goal with these with this series and these episodes here. So I'm just going to dive in, and the first player that we're going to talk about is dopamine. Okay, so we've probably heard about dopamine. I know I've talked about it and definitely in passing. So dopamine is considered sort of that rewarding neurotransmitter. They call it that rewarding molecule. It's often a big key player in addictive behaviors. It's that reward driven, that seeking pleasure neurotransmitter. So when we accomplish something, right, when you set a goal and you achieve it and you get that boost of positive feelings, that's usually your dopamine boost. It's what the casinos target when you go to the casino and you're sitting in that chair, and if you're getting one with lots of like stimuli, with noises and lights, they're affirming that dopamine pathway. It's also the same pathway that illicit drugs like cocaine and meth target, right? And so when we don't have enough dopamine, or when our brain's not producing enough dopamine, we can see issues like Parkinson's, right? Is when our body's not producing enough dopamine. If you look at cases with bipolar, usually that swing, the manic side is usually your body's producing too much dopamine, and then it moves into that depressive swing. So the bipolar can also be affecting our dopamine pathways.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we don't have dopamine, we can get withdrawals, right? We can kind of get cravings. And so whether those cravings are for things, whatever that, behavior may be, whether that's food, whether that's a substance, whether that's technology, whether that's exercise, whether that's an abusive relationship, you can kind of fill in the blank. But dopamine is what creates that pathway of, we seek pleasure, something fulfills that. And then when that is removed or taken away, we have withdrawals or cravings for that particular action, behavior, emotion, even a relationship. Um, So to influence how we increase dopamine, right? Again, if you positive ways you can increase dopamine, right? Are things if you set a goal and you achieve it. Once you achieve that goal, then you start to create. You get that dopamine burst as well, so you can increase your levels of dopamine by creating that cycle for yourself. Instead of looking, outward at these other behaviors or emotions.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Perfect. So there is when I was doing some of my homework and research, I'm not sure that I completely agree with this, but Psychology Today was shedding some light, saying that there was a little bit of evidence that people who are a little bit more on the extroverted side have more prominent dopamine pathways. That oftentimes they have a little bit more that an uninhibited personality will have a little bit, their brain may release dopamine a little bit easier, if you will. Yeah. I thought, I don't know if that's entirely true that I've seen. I said, I think that maybe has changed with, especially with social media, because you can see, different outlets in which maybe less extroverted folks can also create reward pathways. Yeah. In social media or online in different aspects instead of out amongst the people. So,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah. Okay. So that is dopamine. All right. Our second player I wanted to introduce today is oxytocin. All right. Have you heard of oxytocin?
I have heard of the word. I don't
Okay.
necessarily know what it does.
That's okay. So oxytocin is considered the bonding molecule. Okay. Most of the original research for oxytocin was done with moms and babies. Because the oxytocin, it's sort of that you see that bonding right with moms and babies, but you also see surges of that oxytocin in relationships with partners. And so a lot of the research has been around that relationships, right? Whether that's family, whether that's partners. And so we can see that as we bond with somebody, we can have increased rates of oxytocin. Okay. Now, they've also seen this with people with pets, right? If people aren't in a relationship or aren't in, and they have a pet, they've done research with just snuggling with a pet can increase oxytocin levels as well. What's tricky about oxytocin is it can have two very opposite reactions. Okay. So oxytocin, if it high levels of oxytocin, if it acts on our amygdala in our brain, and we've talked about our amygdala before in relationship to fear and cortisol release. But if it affects our amygdala, it's actually the oxytocin is very calming and can reduce our stress. It can actually lessen our pain, even. Okay. And lessen those withdrawal symptoms, right? Or those craving symptoms we might have with a dopamine withdrawal, we can mitigate with higher levels of oxytocin.
Okay.
Okay. Now, the trick is with oxytocin, so that's our preferred pathway, right? Of how we would want our neurotransmitters to be released. We would prefer it to go to that particular one to go to oxytocin or to the amygdala to promote that less stress and calming sensation.
Okay.
Right? Well, the opposite side is that oxytocin, high levels of oxytocin, can also go to a different area in our brain called the lateral septum. If that pathway is the pathway of preference, then we see more distress. We get the opposite effect. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen a lot of research in this, especially like in abusive relationships, right? Where it's a bonding issue, right? Like you've bonded with somebody that you care about, but that person is taking advantage of the situation. It is more, instead of a positive, healthy relationship, it's more of an abusive relationship. But it's hard to separate that, right? It's hard to separate that bond with this increased stress. And so then we get things kind of like a trauma bond. But so increasing our levels of oxytocin can be very helpful if we have the path of preference is to the amygdala. Okay.
So I used to, when I was in grad school, I worked for CASA. And
Okay.
CASA
Yes.
is Court Appointed Special Advocates. So kids that have been there in the system for abuse and neglect. Is that what keeps them bonded to their abusive parents? Is that oxytocin pathway to the, what did you call it?
Lateral septum.
The lateral septum.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. Yep. For kids, yeah. And people will always wonder, or people may wonder, okay, if they can see that abusive relationship, even between a husband and a wife, and they're like, why don't you just leave, right? Like, why don't you just start over? Well, it's not that easy. Same thing with kids, right? They may run away from a safe environment and go back to an abusive or neglected environment because of that human bonding. Because they're, in a sense, right, like they I don't know that I can say they're addicted to that, but that they've created that strong bond. So even though it's not safe, so that you get that surge of oxytocin, well, that feels good. But if it's going to the lateral septum, it's actually more stressful and creates distress within our body than it does that calming sensation.
Yeah, interesting. And I think it's like this, I loved this saying, like, the devil you know is better than the devil you don't know. Because that's what it feels like from a domestic violence perspective. It's like, yes, I intellectually understand that this is verbal and emotional abuse, but there's like some kind of a sense of like safety in it because it's like known. And the fear of the unknown is much more terrifying than the chaos within.
Right. Yeah. So we can see how that translates, right? And just the neurochemical changes in our brain.
Yeah.
So to increase that oxytocin and to help to solidify that preferred pathway to the amygdala, is things like being connected with people, right? In a creative, supportive environment, right? So even if we're not experiencing a domestic violence or an abusive or neglected relationship, even just by creating a support system, a group of friends, right, relationships with people in your life will help to increase that oxytocin levels, but also to solidify that preferred pathway to the amygdala versus the lateral septum.
I gotcha.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So let's see. Number 3 is our endorphins. Okay. So most folks, we've heard of our endorphins because they are. It was originally theorized that our endorphins were things like people will call like a runner's high, right? Or like we get endorphins. They're also called endogenous opioids. Endorphins essentially means self-produced morphine, right? So the more physical activity that we have within our life, the more endorphins our body releases. So that usually produces less pain, usually produces a better mood, more driven, right? Is when we see higher endorphins being released in our brain, right?
Oh, interesting. So that's like there's a correlation. I don't know. I've never done any research, but I know I have a high pain tolerance and I've seen that in like athletes.
Yes.
Okay. There is a correlation for these
Very much
endorphins. Like,
correlation.
yeah. And a higher pain threshold. Okay.
Exactly. So when you have when you're more active, right, you will have higher pain tolerances because of that increased endorphins just circulating throughout your body, right? Yeah. So you can also have increased endorphins with the physical exertion, with exercise, with weightlifting, but also with orgasms and with sex, right? So even people who maybe not as athletic, but if they're having consistent sexual interactions and orgasms, you can also increase those endorphins as well. Yeah. Um, and so similar thing, if you don't have as many endorphins, right? If you have less endorphins, then you have usually more pain. Usually folks will feel a little bit more loss, almost in the sense of grief, if we have less endorphins circulating throughout our body.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's see. What else do I want to say about endorphins? In 99, they did a lot of research on acupuncture and endorphins, and they found that inserting acupuncture needles can actually increase endorphins as well. So one of the theories of why acupuncture is so effective for pain and for calming, for stress, for sort of that homeostasis, is because it helps to stimulate the release of endorphins as well.
Okay, that makes sense.
So that's another way we can get more endorphins. Okay, number 1, 2, I'm off track. 4 is GABA. Okay, so I don't know if I can tell you what GABA stands for off the top of my head, but GABA is considered an inhibitory molecule. Okay, it's also considered the anti-anxiety molecule. So GABA is usually when people experience a lot of anxiety, it's usually GABA that's targeted because GABA naturally slows things down. Because it's inhibitory, it stops the progression of other neurotransmitters from being released. Okay. So usually that pathway is targeted with anti-anxiety meds like Xanax or Valium, any of those like benzodiazepine, diazepine class of medications. They're always targeting GABA pathways. Okay. So when we're looking at GABA, because it's that inhibitory, it's what promotes our relaxation, our calmness. Okay, is usually where that GABA goes. So even in some of the research with ADHD and ADD, they target GABA pathways to a certain extent, maybe more on the naturopathic side than they do on the conventional side. Because of people with ADD and ADHD, if they can increase their GABA production and those GABA pathways, then they can learn to not have that constant or not respond to that constant stimuli, right? They kind of have that a little bit a better filter, if you will. So let's see. I talked about the benzo. So let's see. Oh, I can't tell you the year, but one of the studies that came out is they looked at yoga and the practice of yoga and the effect on GABA. And what they found is that they took students and they put them in 2 different groups. One group, they had them do a 60-minute yoga session, and then the other group, they had them just sit down and read a book. In the yoga session, they had a 27% increase in GABA levels among those who were in the yoga class versus those who just read a book for 60 minutes. They didn't notice when they took the measurements of GABA before the activities and then post. Those that read a book didn't really see a significant change in their GABA levels, but those, who did yoga for 60 minutes did. So by increasing the yoga, mindful meditation, deep breathing or that diaphragmatic breathing, they've seen direct relationships in increasing that GABA release to help promote that calmness and relaxation in our body.
Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to answer this, but because you mentioned like yoga and then mindful meditation.
Yes.
So is it the movement of yoga, the asanas, or is it the breathing meditation part, or is it the combo?
So I cannot answer that directly. You're
Okay.
correct. We don't know for sure, right? But because I don't know, I did not find a study that talked about the percentage change in GABA with mindful meditation. So if I could find that study and we can compare those, then we could say, okay, what part of the yoga were they finding the most helpful? And to be honest, this review of the study doesn't even tell me what kind of yoga they did for 60 minutes. So I don't have enough information to answer that question appropriately.
Yeah. Okay.
Yet.
Yeah. Yeah. My instinct says it's probably the combo.
Yeah. I think it would make sense for it to be the combo because it's not just, so when we're talking about GABA, and maybe I should step back just a little bit, because when we're talking about these main players, right, as far as these are neurochemicals within our brain, so they affect our chemistry, but they directly affect our the electrical component, those brain waves that are always occurring within our brain, and the architecture of our brain, right? Like, so the structure of our brain. And because we're now talking about them as neurotransmitters, we're actually learning more and more in neurobiology and neurochemistry and sort of that neuro field that these are not just released from our brain, they're actually released all over our body. So we can measure them a little bit easier from our brain. But say when we get that surge of dopamine or that surge of GABA, it's not just from our brain, it's being released from a lot of different areas and a lot of different cells within our body. Yeah. So it's kind of this simultaneous once it's triggered, right, it's kind of this releasing everywhere. It's not just a direct from point A to point B.
Okay. It's like a wave sort of throughout the body.
Yeah. So one of the researchers, she kind of described in general, like these neurochemicals, we've always thought, that they acted a lot like a lock and key, right? That it was kind of this one neurotransmitter opened this door. So it was the key and it opened a lock. And then once it opened this door, then X, Y, and Z could happen. Okay. And she describes it that that's not an accurate picture. Think of it more as sort of this trigger and it's released. And then it creates a frequency, kind of like a doorbell, right? So instead of a lock and key, you're creating a doorbell, and then that resonance, right, that frequency which the doorbell rings, releases sort of this pattern throughout your whole body
of vibrational waves.
Exactly. That's when we're going back to physics too. So there is a lot to still be learned as far as how our brain works, how it affects the rest of our body. But yeah, by understanding these players a little bit, hopefully we can kind of shed a little bit more light in how things change when our thoughts and feelings, right, engage different aspects of or are engaged in different aspects of our life.
Right, because thoughts is it creates neurons that fire together, wire together. So it creates a neurological response between these neurons, a thought does.
Yes.
Which then that neurological response, vibration, is the emotion.
Yes.
So it's the doorbell effect. The emotion is the frequency of the doorbell.
Exactly.
Thought.
Yeah. And that produces, right, as that doorbell rings throughout our body, that produces usually a physiological response, whether we're paying attention to it or not. because they're connected.
Yeah.
So closely connected.
Okay. So I have two questions, and I don't know, like, you're the one that planned out the episode, so you can just be like, this will be in episode 2 or 3 or whatever, if this question doesn't relate to now, right? Can you, like, the structure of the brain, you said that, like, these impact the structure, like, what does that mean? Like, when you say structure, I'm thinking like the actual, like, physical anatomy of my brain. If you dissected my brain, like, that's what I think when you say that.
So, okay. No, now's a good time to explain that while we're talking about the players. So the structure is the architecture, right? So you're right. It's kind of that framework. So our brain is 75% fat, right?
Okay.
And it is we have different components, right, within our brain. And we have the pathways, right, which is usually our neural signaling pathways, which are like the highways that we've described, right? So it is an architecture. So there's a framework in which that things don't really change, but because of neuroplasticity, we can change them with the neurochemicals based on the frequency that these neurochemicals are secreted or stimulated.
So in my world, I describe it like highways. Like, we have
Yeah.
a belief and it's like a super highway. So it's very easy for our brain to access that. So is that what you're referring to? It's like we're changing the highways?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm referring to. Yeah. The different aspects in our brain, like the amygdala, the lateral septum, the hypothalamus, all of those can also change in size and variation depending on those highways, right? Those highways are really what we call that neuroplasticity. So if you reconstruct a highway to a different location, right? You build a new road, you're going to change the shape and the effect of the structure of your brain, if you will.
Okay, because different areas increase and decrease in size.
Yes.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
It's responsive in that sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
Did you have another question?
I did, but I can't remember it at the moment. So do you have anything else?
Okay. All right. Two more players I want to introduce to us real quick. Okay. This one that we've heard of, or that you probably have heard of, is serotonin, right? We hear of serotonin a lot. It's considered the confidence molecule. Serotonin is usually very a key player with mood, right? We hear of serotonin is what most antidepressants target are serotonin pathways. From the SSRIs to the SNRIs. Those are specific in trying to keep serotonin around in our brain longer. There's proposed information out there that the mechanism isn't quite what they think it is when they're recommending SSRIs or SNRIs, since it takes a couple of weeks to be fully effective. That it might actually be promoting what we call neurogenesis or new production of those pathways, and not just keeping serotonin around a little bit longer.
Okay.
But so serotonin is often associated with like a sense of accomplishment, right? Like self-esteem, that sort of thing, balancing out like your mood. The easiest way to increase serotonin is to work on feelings of worthiness, right? Like the more that we feel worthy, that will stimulate a surge of serotonin to be produced within our body.
Yeah.
And there's been a lot of research with serotonin in the gut relationship, right? That we also, like I said, all these neurotransmitters are not just secreted in our brain, but also throughout our whole body. There has been a lot of research just within the last 4 or 5 years about that gut brain connection. But serotonin, because it is Usually because we have a lot of serotonin in our body. It's easy to measure, if you will. And so we can see those changes of serotonin when our gut health is not great. But when our serotonin isn't produced easily in the gut, it won't be produced easily in the brain either. So it's kind of vice versa. Both of those still have that direct relationship. And so let's see, the more serotonin we have, it increases our, what do they call that? Because it increases your self-esteem. It reduces that, like what they call rejection sensitivity, right? So that like not feeling like you belong, that, you know, feeling like you're getting rejected, whatever that looks like for somebody, that the more serotonin you have, the less blow that, you know, creates in our life, I
Super
guess. Yeah.
interesting. What was it? Ritalin?
Ritalin.
So does Ritalin, that that's what a lot of kids will take like in college, right? To like
Oh yeah, help with focus.
is that stimulating a bunch of serotonin?
So Ritalin is methylphenidate. It helps more on the dopamine side, a little bit on the serotonin as well, but a little bit more on the dopamine side. Yeah, I believe.
Okay, because the reason I asked, like I'm studying like super successful people, like Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, right? Like all these very high achievers. And like what is the correlation between them? So then we can see what the difference is between them and the average person, right? Speaking of, make a plug. Next month in book club, we're reading Mindset by Dr. Carol Dweck, and I think that's gonna shed a lot of light on it. But the correlating factors between extreme success and the correlating factors is confidence and the unwillingness to quit. That is it. Those are the only two factors that separate extreme success from average.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm listening to you just then, and I'm thinking, like, oh my gosh, it would be interesting to see the levels of serotonin in these extremely successful people.
Yeah.
Like, no wonder, like, the average person, like, if you don't have good gut health, right, and you don't have enough serotonin, it's like climbing Mount Everest. Like, if you want to be successful and you're in this deficit with serotonin, you need to feel the confidence to be failure. What did you call it? Like, uh,
Rejection sensitivity.
failure rejection sensitivity. Like, if you're in that deficit, you don't feel confident and you're highly sensitive to rejection and failure. Like, those are two major components that are required confidence and the ability to keep going and not quit to be
Right.
extremely successful.
Right. Yeah. You're exactly right. When we think about it, right, this is just a different way to kind of break it down and kind of look behind the scenes and say, oh, okay, now you can see what's happening in our brain and in our body that helps to lay that foundation or that groundwork so that people, you know, who fail that 50 times before they're successful, and you're like, well, you know, if they had a lower threshold for rejection sensitivity, right, then those 50 times that they failed, it wasn't a big blow. It's like, yeah, okay, well, I'm just going to keep going.
Yeah.
And that's directly related to what their serotonin levels look like.
I mean, I'm gonna apologize. This is fucking mind blowing because there's so much shame around like not being able to be successful, right? And like I'll just use myself as an example. Like you go back and like I struggled with depression and anxiety since I was 13 and I've never had good gut health. Two indicators that like, right, like I probably haven't had high serotonin. And not knowing this, you have so much shame, like, what's wrong with me? Right? Like, why have I always struggled with this? Why haven't I been able to be successful? And I look at people like Amanda Francis, or you look at like these young influencers that are in their 20s and like they're so confident and so successful. And you're like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be like that?
Yeah.
And for you to say, like, maybe it's not your fault. Maybe it's like your gut health and you just don't have enough serotonin. So you've got these huge things working against you all the time. And it's not you and your incapability, it's your chemical makeup that can be fixed.
Right. It's just the terrain that's within your physiology right now. Right. Yeah. But that can be transient. Yeah. I mean, that can definitely change. Once we, you know, look at these relationships. Yeah. And we get a better understanding as to, you know, the greater picture and what's happening within our health, within our mindset. And what those big players are.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
It's
huge.
almost like I won't say there's like a little battle between therapists and life coaches.
Oh,
Right. Um, and but it's almost like we don't even like we have to start like we should just start with like a chemical panel. Like you start with a doctor and you figure out where's the serotonin, where's the dopamine, and then we add in therapy or life coaching. They have to be complementary. Like doing one or the other, one just going to the doctor and getting meds doesn't fully help.
no, because you're not changing the terrain, right? You're
Right.
not changing, um, you're not creating those highways, right? You're
Right.
just adding more neurochemicals
Uh-huh.
into the mix, hoping that that will change things,
Okay.
right? And hoping that that change will be permanent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, But if you're not creating those highways and stimulating your brain to produce those neurochemicals, you're not getting as far in treatment as you could be. Yeah.
And if you're just going to therapy and not addressing the chemical issue,
Then,
it feels like you're banging your head against the wall. Like you
yeah.
have all these tools, and it's like, why am I still struggling?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. In my opinion, they have to go hand in hand, right?
Yeah. Yes, I
That's
agree. I feel like
yeah,
you're a rarity, though.
right. Well,
I've
that
been
may
in
be,
this world
but
forever, and
yeah.
no one has ever told me like it has to go hand in hand, Kim. Let's do both. And if they have, the right hand did not know what the left hand was doing.
Yeah. It there has to be a level of understanding of what's going on, and there has to be a little bit of a transparency, right? And say, okay, well, let's really, I mean, we're always trying to look for the root cause, right? Let's lay all the cards on the table and try to figure out what makes the most sense, as to what the big factors are that are contributing to the current state, right, of somebody's health, wellness.
Mhm.
Yeah. But you are right. I mean, that's why I like to take a whole person approach. That's why we created, Thrive and Aligned Healing, to look at the mind, the body, and the spirit, right? Because if you're not looking at the whole picture, I mean, you can be looking in a window all day and still not get to see everything.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so when we look at the whole picture and you open that door, you're like, oh, wow, I would have never seen this by just looking at this angle through the window.
Yeah. I mean, I just had a huge shift just in this session, like a release of so much shame of failure.
Yeah. 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 I'm glad that we were able to shed a little bit of light, right, to see that, because it's not because when you carry that, right, when you carry that those feelings, right, that of shame and of guilt, you're creating a different highway
Right.
that's not, promoting a consistent release of the positive sides of these neurotransmitters. And next session, we are going to talk about the positive and the negative emotions and those feelings and how what they bring to the table, right? And how they create those, because it's very different, right? There's still these players that are involved, but we're looking more into like the chemistry makeup of how these players are involved. So.
Well, I think that's a great segue.
I think so too.
All right, friends, tune in for next week. The continue of the saga. Thanks, Carmen.
Thank you.